25 years after two decorated police officers vanished without a trace, a construction crew just unearthed their buried patrol car from beneath tons of Texas soil. Picture this. It's a sweltering August morning in 2023. The sun hasn't even crested the horizon, but the construction workers are already sweating through their shirts. They're breaking ground on a new strip mall just outside Pine Bluff, Texas, when the excavator's steel teeth scrape against something that definitely shouldn't be there. Metal. Lots of it. The foreman, Jake Martinez, calls for the machine to stop. He's been doing this job for 30 years, and he's seen his share of buried surprises. Old septic tanks, forgotten utility lines, sometimes even Native American artifacts. But as the dirt falls away, revealing the unmistakable shape of a vehicle's roof, Jake feels his stomach drop. "Get the sheriff on the phone," he tells his crew, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." The car is buried deep, maybe 8 feet down. It's been here long enough for small trees to grow above it. As more earth is carefully removed, the faded blue and white paint scheme becomes visible. Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department, Unit 47. Detective Sarah Collings arrives on scene within 20 minutes, her coffee still steaming in the cup holder. She's the department's lead investigator on cold cases, a position she's held for the past 3 years. Sarah has solved cases that others gave up on decades ago, but as she stares down into that excavated hole, she realizes she's looking at the biggest mystery of her career. Unit 47 belonged to Deputies Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega. They disappeared on the night of September 15, 1998, during what should have been a routine traffic stop near Carter Bridge. The car was found abandoned on the side of Highway 287 the next morning, but the two men were never seen again. Now, 25 years later, here's that same patrol car, buried like someone was trying to hide it forever. But why bury an empty car that had already been found? To understand what happened that August morning in 2023, we have to go back to September 15, 1998. It was a Tuesday night, and Pine Bluff was the kind of small Texas town where everybody knew everybody, and crime was usually limited to domestic disputes and the occasional drunk driver. Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega were partners in every sense of the word. They'd been working together for 3 years, and their friendship extended well beyond their shifts. Daniel was 32, married to his high school sweetheart Rebecca, with twin daughters who had just turned 5. He was the kind of cop who still believed in protecting and serving, who'd give you a warning instead of a ticket if he thought you'd learned your lesson. Luis was 28, single, and the department's rising star. He'd graduated top of his class from the police academy and had already earned 2 commendations for bravery. His parents had immigrated from Mexico when he was 3, and becoming a police officer was Luis's way of giving back to the community that had welcomed his family. That night, they were patrolling the stretch of Highway 287 that runs along the Brazos River. It's a lonely road after dark, cutting through farmland and pine forests, with Carter Bridge marking the halfway point of their usual route. At 10:47 p.m., dispatch received their last radio transmission. Unit 47 to dispatch, we're making a traffic stop on Highway 287 eastbound, about a quarter mile past Carter Bridge. Texas plates, Lima Delta 7942. Copy, Unit 47, run that plate for me. There was a pause. Then, dispatch, that plate comes back to a 1995 Chevrolet Impala, registered to Charles Klein Sullivan. Charles Klein Sullivan. Even saying the name sent a chill through the dispatcher that night. Charlie K.S., as everyone called him, was Pine Bluff's most notorious criminal. He'd been arrested 6 times on charges ranging from drug trafficking to assault, but somehow, some way, the charges never seemed to stick. Unit 47, be advised, that vehicle is registered to Charles Klein Sullivan. Approach with extreme caution. Copy that, dispatch, The transmission cut off mid-sentence. Not unusual, really. Radio dead zones were common out there, especially near the river. The dispatcher waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. At 11:15 p.m., she tried to raise them again. Unit 47, please respond. Silence. Unit 47, this is dispatch. Please respond to your radio check. More silence. By midnight, the shift supervisor had dispatched 2 other units to Highway 287. They found the patrol car at 12:23 a.m., parked on the shoulder just past Carter Bridge, exactly where Daniel and Luis had said they'd be. The engine was still running. The driver's side door was open. The radio was working perfectly. But Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega were gone. And so was Charles Klein Sullivan. The search began immediately. Every available officer in Pine Bluff County was called in, along with state troopers and federal agents. They had dogs, helicopters, dive teams for the river. For 2 weeks, hundreds of volunteers combed through miles of forest and farmland, following every lead, chasing every rumor. They found nothing. The FBI took over the case after the first week, treating it as a potential kidnapping of federal officers. They interviewed everyone who knew Daniel and Luis, everyone who'd had contact with Charles Klein Sullivan, everyone who'd been on Highway 287 that night. They found nothing. The media attention was intense. 2 Texas deputies vanished without a trace made national headlines. Rebecca Mercer appeared on every news program that would have her, pleading for information about her husband's whereabouts. Luis's parents held vigils, posted flyers, offered rewards. Nothing. Months passed, then years. The case grew cold, filed away with all the other unsolved mysteries that haunt law enforcement. Rebecca eventually moved away with her daughters. Luis's parents kept his bedroom exactly as he'd left it until they both passed away in 2019. The Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department had a memorial service on the 5th anniversary of their disappearance, then the 10th, then stopped having them altogether. Pine Bluff moved on, because that's what small towns do. They bury their mysteries and keep living. But mysteries have a way of clawing back to the surface, especially when someone tries to bury them 8 feet underground. Sarah Collings wasn't even a police officer in 1998. She was 15 years old, living 2 counties over, dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. It wasn't until she was in college that she changed her major to criminal justice, inspired by a professor who told her class that every unsolved case was someone's family still waiting for answers. She joined the Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department in 2018, specifically requesting assignment to cold cases. Sarah had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. She'd re-interview witnesses decades after their initial statements, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. She'd spend hours poring over evidence that other investigators had already examined a dozen times. Her colleagues thought she was wasting her time. Sheriff Mike Brennan, who'd taken over the department in 2015 after the previous sheriff retired, thought her dedication was admirable, but ultimately futile. "Some cases are just unsolvable, Sarah," he told her more than once. "Sometimes people just vanish and we never find out why." But as Sarah stood next to that excavated patrol car in August 2023, she felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just curiosity or professional interest, but a deep, burning certainty that she was looking at the key to solving the biggest mystery in Pine Bluff County history. "How long do you think it's been buried?" she asked the coroner, who was examining the vehicle. "Hard to say exactly, but based on the soil composition and root growth, I'd estimate 20 to 25 years, possibly longer. 25 years, right around the time Daniel and Luis disappeared." Sarah made her first decision as lead investigator on the case. She wasn't going to let this patrol car be moved until she'd examined every inch of it, inside and out, with fresh eyes and 25 years' worth of technological advancement. Her second decision was even more important. She was going to solve this case, no matter how long it took or where the evidence led her. She had no idea the decision would nearly cost her everything. The patrol car had been buried with care. Someone had taken the time to drain the fluids, remove the battery, and even cover the windows with plastic sheeting to prevent moisture damage. This wasn't a hasty disposal. This was preservation. But why preserve evidence of a crime? Sarah spent 3 days going through the vehicle with a forensics team borrowed from the state police. They found fingerprints that matched Daniel and Luis, as expected. They found trace evidence of marijuana in the back seat, which wasn't particularly surprising for a police vehicle that had made countless arrests over the years. What they didn't find was any blood, any signs of struggle, any indication that violence had occurred inside the car. But they found something else, something that made Sarah's hands shake as she held the evidence bag up to the light. A single business card, wedged deep between the driver's seat and center console, so far down that it had been missed during the original investigation. The card was for a law firm in Dallas, Morrison, Keller and Associates, attorneys at law. On the back, someone had written a phone number in Daniel Mercer's handwriting, followed by the words, "Ask for Janet." Sarah called the law firm that afternoon. Morrison, Keller and Associates had been disbanded in 2003, but she managed to track down Janet Morrison, who was now working as a private investigator in Austin. "I remember that case," Janet said when Sarah explained why she was calling. "Daniel Mercer contacted me in September of 1998. He said he had evidence of corruption in the Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department, and he wanted to know about witness protection programs." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of corruption?" "He wouldn't say over the phone. We scheduled a meeting for September 20th, 1998. He never showed up." September 20th was 5 days after Daniel and Luis disappeared. Did he mention his partner, Luis Vega? Yes. He said they'd both stumbled onto something big, something that involved their sheriff directly. He was scared, Detective Collins, really scared. He said they were thinking about going to the FBI, but they wanted to have all their evidence organized first. Sarah thanked Janet and hung up the phone, her mind racing. Daniel and Luis hadn't been random victims. They'd been targeted, eliminated because they'd discovered something that threatened powerful people in Pine Bluff County. But what had they discovered? And who had they threatened? The answer to those questions would lead Sarah into the darkest corners of Pine Bluff's history, where she'd discover that sometimes the people sworn to protect and serve are the ones you need protection from most. Sheriff Harlan Ross had been Pine Bluff County's top law enforcement officer from 1995 to 2014. He'd retired with full honors, a pension, and the gratitude of a community that remembered him as tough but fair. He'd moved to a lake house 40 miles outside of town, where he spent his days fishing and his evenings drinking bourbon on his back porch. At least, that's what everyone thought he was doing. Sarah's investigation into the buried patrol car had led her to request all the original case files from 1998. What she found troubled her deeply. The investigation into Daniel and Luis's disappearance had been thorough in some ways and surprisingly lacking in others. For instance, there were detailed interviews with their families, friends, and fellow officers. But there was almost no investigation into Charles Klein Sullivan's activities, his associates, or his possible motives for making 2 police officers vanish. Even more suspicious, Sheriff Harlan Ross had personally handled much of the evidence in the case. He'd been the one to process the abandoned patrol car. He'd been the one to interview Charlie K.S.'s known associates. He'd been the one to decide when the search efforts should be scaled back. Sarah requested Charlie K.S.'s arrest records and found something interesting. Every time he'd been arrested between 1995 and 2014, the charges had eventually been dropped or reduced to minor infractions every single time. The reasons varied. Witnesses recanted, evidence went missing, procedural errors invalidated searches. It was possible that Charlie K.S. was just lucky or that he had a very good lawyer. But Sarah had been a cop long enough to recognize patterns, and this pattern screamed corruption. She decided to pay a visit to Harlan Ross. The drive to Lake Buchanan took her through rolling hills and sparse farmland. Ross's house was impressive, far more impressive than what a small-town sheriff should have been able to afford on his salary. It was a 2-story cabin with a wraparound porch, situated on several acres of prime lakefront property. Ross answered the door with a fishing rod in his hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Detective Collins, isn't it? I heard someone was stirring up that old case again. Can't say I'm surprised, what with the car being found and all. I was hoping you might have some time to talk about the investigation, Sheriff Ross." "I'm looking at it with fresh eyes. and I thought you might have some insights that weren't in the official reports. Come on in. Coffee? The inside of the house was even more impressive than the outside. Hardwood floors, leather furniture, a stone fireplace that probably cost more than Sarah made in a year. Ross served coffee in expensive china cups and settled into a chair across from her. That was a hard case, he said. Those boys were good officers. Daniel especially. He had a real future in law enforcement. The files show that Charles Klein Sullivan was a person of interest, but it doesn't look like he was ever seriously investigated. Ross's expression darkened slightly. Charlie K.S. was a small-time troublemaker, Detective. Drugs, theft, the occasional assault. But making 2 police officers disappear? That's not his style. Then what do you think happened to them? Honestly, I think they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Highway 287 runs along the border with Mexico cartel territory. My theory was always that they stumbled into something bigger than Pine Bluff County crime, and the cartels eliminated them as a precaution. It was a plausible theory, and it had been the FBI's working hypothesis for most of their investigation. But Sarah had noticed something in the files that bothered her. The FBI had requested assistance from Sheriff Ross in identifying potential cartel contacts in the area. His response had been that Pine Bluff County was too small and too far north to be of interest to major drug organizations. Yet, here he was, suggesting that cartels had eliminated 2 of his deputies. Sheriff Ross, when you processed their patrol car, did you find any evidence that they'd been involved in a drug interdiction? No, but that doesn't mean anything. These people are professionals. They clean up after themselves. Sarah nodded and asked a few more questions, but Ross's answers were consistent with his original reports. As she prepared to leave, she asked one final question. Do you know if Daniel or Luis had any concerns about corruption in the department? For just a moment, Ross's composed exterior cracked. Sarah saw something flash across his face, fear, anger, maybe both. What kind of concerns? I don't know. That's why I'm asking. No, Ross said firmly. They never mentioned anything like that to me, and I would have been the first person they'd come to if they had suspicions about anyone in the department. Sarah thanked him for his time and left, but as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Harlan Ross knew more than he was saying. A lot more. Back in Pine Bluff, Sarah began digging deeper into the relationship between Sheriff Ross and Charles Klein Sullivan. What she found made her stomach turn. Charlie K.S. had been arrested 17 times between 1995 and 2014. 17 times, and he'd never served more than 30 days in jail. The arresting officers varied, but every single case had been processed through Sheriff Ross's office, and every single case had fallen apart before reaching trial. Sarah pulled the financial records for both men, using a warrant sheet obtained based on the new evidence from the buried patrol car. What she discovered was a complex web of money transfers, property purchases, and business relationships that painted a very different picture of Pine Bluff County law enforcement. In 1996, Ross had purchased his lake house for cash. The seller was a shell company that traced back to Charlie K.S. In 1999, Charlie had bought a legitimate business, K.S. Auto Repair, with financing provided by a bank where Ross served on the board of directors. In 2001, Ross's daughter had received a full scholarship to Rice University from a private foundation that Charlie K.S. had donated to heavily. The connections went on and on. For nearly 20 years, Harlan Ross and Charles Klein Sullivan had been in business together, using the sheriff's office to facilitate whatever criminal enterprises Charlie was running. But what kind of criminal enterprises? And how did Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega fit into all of this? Sarah was about to find out, and the truth would be worse than she'd imagined. Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mary Chen, the Pine Bluff County Clerk's office records manager. Mary had worked for the county for 37 years and had the institutional memory that comes with that kind of longevity. "Detective Collings," Mary said when Sarah stopped by to request additional files. "I've been following your investigation in the papers. There's something you should know about those missing deputies." Mary led Sarah to a storage room in the basement of the courthouse, filled with file boxes dating back decades. 3 months after those boys disappeared, Sheriff Ross came down here personally, said he needed to remove some sensitive files from the evidence room, something about ongoing federal investigations that required special handling. "Did you see what files he took?" "That's just it. He didn't take them out of the building. He moved them down here, to this storage room. Said they needed to be kept secure but separate from active case files." Mary led Sarah to a corner where 3 file boxes sat covered with dust. Each box was labeled with a case number that Sarah didn't recognize. "I probably should have mentioned this years ago, but Ross made it clear that these files were not to be accessed without his direct authorization. Even after he retired, no one ever asked about them." Sarah's hands were shaking as she opened the first box. Inside were surveillance photos, financial records, wire transfer documentation, and detailed reports that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it made her head spin. Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of Sheriff Ross taking bribes from Charlie K.S. They'd uncovered a sophisticated operation that had turned Pine Bluff County into a major transit point for drug money flowing north from Mexico. The operation was elegant in its simplicity. Charlie K.S. would receive large cash payments from cartel contacts in Houston. Those payments would be deposited into various business accounts around Pine Bluff County, laundered through legitimate enterprises, then transferred north to buyers in Dallas, Oklahoma City, and Kansas City. Sheriff Ross ensured that law enforcement never looked too closely at any of Charlie's activities, and in return, he received a percentage of every transaction. Over the course of nearly 20 years, millions of dollars had flowed through Pine Bluff County, with Ross and Charlie skimming a healthy profit from every deal. But in September of 1998, Daniel and Luis had started noticing patterns. They'd begun documenting unusual traffic on Highway 287, vehicles with out-of-state plates making brief stops at Charlie's auto repair shop. They'd started photographing license plates, noting times and dates, building a case without realizing how dangerous their curiosity had become. The final file in the box made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a handwritten note from Daniel Mercer, dated September 14, 1998, one day before he and Luis disappeared. "Luis and I have enough evidence to bring down the whole operation. Sheriff Ross is dirty. Charlie K.S. is running money for cartels. We're taking everything to the FBI tomorrow. If something happens to us, look for the backup files in Luis's storage unit, Facility 247 on Highway 6. Sarah immediately drove to the storage facility. Unit 247 was still rented under Luis Vega's name, the fees automatically deducted from a bank account that his parents had never closed. Inside the unit, she found boxes of additional documentation, photographs, and most importantly, audio recordings that Daniel and Luis had made of their conversations with various suspects and witnesses. One recording, dated September 12, 1998, was particularly damning. It was a phone conversation between Sheriff Ross and Charlie K.S., discussing an upcoming delivery and the need to handle the deputy problem. Ross's voice was unmistakable. "Those two are getting too curious. We need to do something before they ruin everything." Charlie's response chilled Sarah to the bone. "Don't worry about it, Sheriff. I've got a place where curious cops can think about their career choices for a very long time." Sarah knew she was listening to the planning of Daniel and Luis's elimination. But where was this place that Charlie had mentioned? Sarah's investigation now had momentum, but it also had danger. If Ross and Charlie had killed 2 police officers to protect their operation, they wouldn't hesitate to kill a third. Sarah began taking precautions, varying her routes to and from work, checking her car for tracking devices, carrying her service weapon even when off duty. She also began working with the FBI, sharing everything she'd discovered with Special Agent Maria Santos, who had been assigned to review the old case in light of the new evidence. Together, they started mapping out Charlie K.S.'s various properties and business interests, looking for places where two kidnapped deputies might have been taken. Charlie owned several properties around Pine Bluff County: his auto repair shop, a small ranch outside of town, a warehouse near the railroad tracks, and a hunting cabin deep in the pine forest. Sarah and Agent Santos decided to start with the cabin, since it was the most isolated and therefore the most likely place to hold prisoners without being discovered. The drive to Charlie's hunting cabin took them down increasingly narrow dirt roads, past no trespassing signs and gates that had been left open for so long that weeds had grown up around them. The cabin itself was a modest structure, probably built in the 1970s, with a tin roof and wooden siding that had weathered to a silvery gray. But it was what they found underneath the cabin that would haunt Sarah's dreams for the rest of her life. A hidden entrance, concealed by a false floor panel, led to a basement room that had clearly been constructed for the sole purpose of imprisoning and interrogating people. The walls were soundproofed with foam panels. There were chains anchored to the concrete floor. There was a drain in the center of the room, and Sarah didn't want to think about why someone would need a drain in a room like this. Most horrifying of all, there were personal items belonging to Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega scattered around the room. Daniel's wedding ring, Luis's police academy graduation watch, their badges, which had been removed and tossed carelessly in a corner. Agent Santos was examining the room with a forensics team when she made the discovery that would finally provide closure for the families of the two missing deputies. Behind a loose stone in the basement wall, wrapped in plastic and preserved by the cool, dry conditions, were Daniel's and Luis's service weapons and wallets. Their driver's licenses were still clearly visible, along with family photos that had been in their wallets the night they disappeared. But most importantly, there was a letter. Written in Daniel's handwriting on paper that had been torn from Luis's notebook, it was addressed to their wives and families. If you're reading this, it means Charlie K.S. and Sheriff Ross have killed us. We discovered their money laundering operation, and they couldn't let us expose them. We're being held in a basement somewhere, and we don't think we're going to make it out alive. Tell our families we love them. Tell them we died trying to do the right thing. The letter was signed by both men and dated September 17th, 1998, 2 days after they disappeared. Sarah had to step outside the cabin to compose herself. Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega had been alive for at least 2 days after their disappearance, imprisoned in that horrific basement room, knowing they were going to die. But where were their bodies? And where was Charles Klein Sullivan? Finding Charlie K.S. proved to be more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. After 2014, when Sheriff Ross retired, Charlie had largely disappeared from public view. His auto repair business had been sold to a cousin, his properties had been transferred to various shell companies, and he'd stopped making any public appearances in Pine Bluff County. It was as if he'd vanished, just like Daniel and Luis. But Sarah was persistent, and she had resources that the original investigators hadn't possessed. Through financial records and digital forensics, she managed to trace Charlie's movements through a series of aliases and false identities. He'd been living in a remote cabin in East Texas, about 200 miles from Pine Bluff, under the name Charles Sullivan. No Klein, no K.S., just a quiet, middle-aged man who kept to himself and paid his bills in cash. Sarah and Agent Santos, along with a tactical team from the FBI, approached Charlie's cabin on a gray October morning. They expected resistance, possibly violence, from a man who had murdered at least 2 police officers and had everything to lose. What they found instead was a broken man, aged far beyond his 63 years, who seemed almost relieved to see them. "I've been waiting for this day for 25 years, Charlie said as he stepped onto his front porch with his hands raised. "I've been waiting for someone to figure it all out." Sarah had prepared herself for many possible reactions from Charlie K.S., but she hadn't prepared for cooperation. Charlie Klein Sullivan waived his right to an attorney and gave a full confession that lasted nearly 6 hours. What he revealed painted an even darker picture of Pine Bluff County corruption than Sarah had imagined. The money laundering operation had been Harlan Ross's idea from the beginning. In 1995, when Ross first became sheriff, he'd approached Charlie with a proposition: use Pine Bluff County as a way station for cartel money and split the profits 50-50. Harlan made it sound so simple, Charlie said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just look the other way when certain vehicles pass through town. Make sure my businesses weren't inspected too closely. In return, we'd both make more money than we'd ever dreamed of. For 3 years, the operation had run smoothly. Cartel money flowed north, Ross and Charlie got rich, and Pine Bluff County remained blissfully unaware of the criminal enterprise operating right under their noses. But Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega had been good cops, too good for their own safety. They'd started noticing patterns, asking questions, following up on suspicions that other officers might have ignored. Harlan tried to get them transferred to different shifts, different parts of the county, Charlie said, but they kept digging. And in September of 1998, they figured out enough to bring us all down. On the night of September 15th, Sheriff Ross had called Charlie with urgent news. Daniel and Luis had arranged a meeting with the FBI for September 20th. They had to be stopped before they could testify. Ross had used his position to monitor police radio traffic, and when Daniel and Luis called in the traffic stop on Charlie's vehicle, he'd contacted Charlie immediately. I was supposed to lead them somewhere isolated and just scare them, make them understand that they needed to drop their investigation, but when they saw me, they knew. They knew everything. Charlie had forced the 2 deputies at gunpoint to drive to his hunting cabin. For 2 days, he and Ross had tried to convince them to stay quiet about what they'd discovered, offering bribes, threats, anything to avoid having to kill 2 police officers. But they wouldn't break. They kept saying they'd taken an oath to serve and protect, and they weren't going to let us turn their county into a drug highway. On September 17th, Charlie had killed Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega. He wouldn't say exactly how, but he provided enough details to convince Sarah that his confession was genuine. "What did you do with their bodies?" Sarah asked. Charlie looked away, his shoulders shaking. Harlan said we had to make sure they were never found. He said if their bodies turned up, there would be too many questions, too much scrutiny. Charlie had disposed of the bodies in a way that ensured they would never be recovered, but he refused to provide specific details. "Why did you bury their patrol car?" Agent Santos asked. That was Harlan's idea too. He said finding an empty car would make it look like they'd just wandered off, maybe gotten lost in the woods. But if the car disappeared completely, people would know something criminal had happened. So Ross had arranged for the patrol car to be found, processed for evidence, and then quietly buried on property that Charlie owned. It was meant to stay hidden forever, just like the truth about Daniel and Luis's fate. But Charlie's cooperation came with a condition. He wanted to make a statement to the families of the 2 murdered deputies. He wanted to apologize, to express remorse, to somehow try to atone for what he'd done. Sarah wasn't sure that any apology could heal the wounds that Charlie and Ross had inflicted on the Mercer and Vega families, but she agreed to arrange a meeting. What happened at that meeting would change everything. Rebecca Mercer had remarried in 2005, 7 years after Daniel's disappearance. She now lived in California with her husband and daughters, but she flew back to Texas the moment Sarah called with news about the case. Luis's parents had both passed away, but his sister Maria lived in San Antonio and had never stopped hoping that someday she'd learn what happened to her brother. The meeting took place at the Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department in a conference room that had been set up with recording equipment and tissues and as much dignity as Sarah could manage. Charlie was brought in wearing handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the intimidating criminal that Sarah had imagined. Rebecca spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I need to know if he suffered. I need to know if Daniel was in pain." Charlie couldn't meet her eyes as he answered. "They were brave, ma'am. Both of them. Even at the end, they never begged, they never broke." Daniel kept talking about his daughters, about how proud he was of them. Luis kept saying he forgave us, that he hoped we'd find peace someday. Maria Vega leaned forward across the table. "Where are they buried? I need to bring my brother home." This was the moment Sarah had been dreading. Charlie's confession had provided closure about what happened to Daniel and Luis, but it hadn't provided the one thing their families needed most: a place to grieve. "Ma'am," Charlie said, his voice breaking, "Harland and we made sure they couldn't be found. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I can't bring them home to you." The conference room filled with sobs that seemed to echo off the walls. 25 years of wondering, of hoping, of refusing to accept that their loved ones were gone. And it had all led to this moment. Rebecca stood up from the table, walked around to where Charlie was sitting, and did something that surprised everyone in the room. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for telling us the truth," she said. "It's not enough, but it's something." Charlie looked up at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Genuine remorse. "Mrs. Mercer, I know you probably can't forgive me, but I want you to know that not a day has gone by in 25 years that I haven't thought about what I did to your family. To both your families." Maria Vega stood up as well, but instead of offering comfort, she had questions. Where is Sheriff Ross? Why isn't he here answering for what he did? That was the question Sarah had been hoping to avoid, because the answer was going to make everyone in that room even angrier than they already were. Harland Ross was dead. Sarah had discovered this when she'd tried to arrest him the previous week. The lake house where she'd interviewed him was empty, with signs that Ross had left quickly. His neighbors reported that they hadn't seen him in several days. 2 days later, Ross's body was found floating in Lake Buchanan, an apparent suicide. He'd left a note confessing to his role in the money laundering operation and the murder of Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, but claiming that Charlie K.S. had acted alone in killing the 2 deputies. Even in death, Harland Ross was trying to minimize his responsibility. The suicide note had been carefully crafted to make Ross appear as a corrupted officer who'd gotten in over his head, rather than the architect of a decades-long criminal enterprise. It painted Charlie as the mastermind, and Ross as a reluctant participant who'd been blackmailed into cooperation. Sarah didn't believe a word of it, and neither did Charlie K.S. Harland was the brains behind everything, Charlie had told her. I was just muscle, someone to do the dirty work while he kept his hands clean. The murder, the cover-up, burying the car, all of that was his idea. But now Ross was beyond the reach of justice, and Charlie would have to face the consequences alone. The families weren't satisfied with this resolution, and Sarah couldn't blame them. 2 men were responsible for destroying their lives, but only one would face trial. "It's not fair," Maria Vega said after Sarah explained about Ross's suicide. "He gets to escape punishment while we're left with nothing." Sarah understood their frustration, but she also knew that Charlie's confession and the evidence they'd gathered would at least provide some measure of justice. What she didn't know was that the case wasn't over yet. 3 weeks after Charlie's confession, Sarah received a call that would change everything she thought she knew about the case. It was from Agent Santos, and her voice was urgent. "Sarah, you need to get down to the federal building right away. Charlie wants to talk to you, and he says he's been lying about something important." Sarah's stomach dropped. If Charlie had been lying about parts of his confession, it could unravel the entire case. Worse, it might mean that Daniel and Luis's families would have to endure even more uncertainty about their loved one's fate. When Sarah arrived at the federal building, she found Charlie in an interview room, looking more agitated than she'd ever seen him. He was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his gray hair. "I can't live with it anymore," he said before Sarah had even sat down. "I've been lying about something, and it's eating me alive." "What have you been lying about, Charlie?" "The bodies. Daniel and Luis. I told you they could never be recovered, but that's not true." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Where are they, Charlie?" "They're not dead." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at Charlie, certain she'd misheard him. "What did you say?" "Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega aren't dead, Detective Collins. They're alive." Charlie's new story was almost impossible to believe, but as he provided details, Sarah realized it might actually be true. On September 17th, 1998, Charlie hadn't killed Daniel and Luis. Instead, facing the reality of what he and Ross had been planning, he'd made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "I couldn't do it," Charlie said, his voice shaking. "I'd done a lot of bad things in my life, but I'd never killed anyone, especially not police officers. When I looked at those two men, thinking about their families, their kids, I just couldn't pull the trigger." Instead, Charlie had offered Daniel and Luis a choice. They could die, or they could disappear. I told them that if they stayed in Texas, Ross would eventually find a way to kill them. But if they were willing to vanish completely, to leave their old lives behind, I could help them start over somewhere else. Sarah was struggling to process what she was hearing. They agreed to this? Not at first, Daniel especially. He kept talking about his wife and daughters, about how he couldn't just abandon them. But I made it clear that those were their only options, death or disappearance. Charlie had contacts throughout the Southwest, people who specialized in creating new identities for those who needed to disappear. Within a week, Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega had new names, new social security numbers, new birth certificates. Where did they go? I can't tell you that. Part of keeping them safe was making sure that no one, not even me, knew exactly where they ended up. But I can tell you they're alive, and they're together. Sarah's mind was reeling. Then whose personal items did we find in the basement? Whose blood? The items were real. I made them give up everything that could identify them as Daniel and Luis. Wedding rings, badges, wallets, everything. The blood, that was mine. I cut myself to make it look like someone had been hurt down there. What about the letter? The one signed by both of them? Charlie looked ashamed. I made them write it. I thought if their bodies were ever found, the letter would explain what happened and implicate Ross. I never thought about how much pain it would cause their families. Sarah stood up from the table, her legs unsteady. If Charlie was telling the truth, then everything she thought she knew about this case was wrong. Why are you telling me this now? Because I met with their families. Because I saw the pain in Rebecca Mercer's eyes when she asked if her husband had suffered. Because Maria Vega is still grieving for a brother who's actually alive somewhere, living under a different name. Charlie pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. This is how you can contact them. But detective, you need to understand. If you reach out to them, if you bring them back, you're putting their lives in danger. Ross might be dead, but the people we were working for aren't. The cartels don't forget, and they don't forgive. Sarah took the paper, her hands shaking. On it was written a phone number and the words, "Ask for David and Miguel." Sarah spent 3 sleepless nights staring at that piece of paper before she finally worked up the courage to make the call. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. Hello? The voice was older than Sarah remembered from the recordings she'd listened to, but there was something familiar about it. Is this David? There was a long pause. Who is this? My name is Detective Sarah Collings. I'm with the Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department. I'm investigating the disappearance of Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega. The silence that followed lasted so long that Sarah thought the caller had hung up. How did you get this number? Charlie Klein Sullivan gave it to me. He told me the truth about what happened 25 years ago. Another long pause. Charlie's in custody? Yes, he confessed to everything. But he also told me that you and Luis are alive. Sarah heard what sounded like sobbing on the other end of the line. Daniel? Is that you? I haven't been Daniel in 25 years, the voice said. I'm David Martinez now. Luis is Miguel Santos. We've been living in New Mexico, working construction, trying to build new lives. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Your wife thinks you're dead. Your daughters think you're dead. I know, Daniel said, and Sarah could hear the pain in his voice. Do you think there's a single day that goes by that I don't think about them? Do you think I wanted to abandon my family? Then why did you? Why didn't you go to the FBI? Why didn't you trust the system to protect you? Daniel's laugh was bitter. The system, detective? The system was Sheriff Harland Ross. The system was a federal investigation that kept hitting dead ends because Ross was feeding information to the people we were trying to expose. Charlie K.S. wasn't wrong when he said Ross would find a way to kill us. The only way to survive was to disappear completely. Sarah understood the logic, but she couldn't accept it. Your daughters grew up without a father. Your wife remarried, thinking you were dead. Don't you think they deserved better than that? Of course they did, Daniel said, his voice breaking, but they deserved a live father more than a dead hero. Convincing Daniel and Luis to return to Texas took weeks of phone calls, careful planning, and promises of federal protection. They were understandably reluctant to give up the lives they'd built in New Mexico, especially when doing so might put them back in danger. But the prospect of seeing their families again, of finally being able to explain what had happened, was too powerful to resist. Sarah arranged for the reunion to take place at a safe house outside of Austin, with FBI protection and complete secrecy. Rebecca flew in from California, bringing her daughters, now 30 years old, who had only fragmentary memories of their father. Maria Vega drove up from San Antonio, clutching a photo of her brother that she'd carried in her purse for 25 years. When Daniel walked into that safe house, 25 years older and weathered by decades of manual labor, Rebecca recognized him immediately. Their embrace lasted several minutes, both of them sobbing and holding each other like they were afraid the other might vanish again. Luis and Maria's reunion was equally emotional. Two siblings who had been forced apart by circumstances beyond their control, finally able to grieve together and heal together. But the reunions also highlighted just how much had been lost. Rebecca's daughters struggled to connect with a father they barely remembered. Rebecca herself had to reconcile the man she'd mourned with the man who had chosen to let her believe he was dead. I remarried, Rebecca told Daniel during one of their private conversations. I have 2 stepchildren. I built a whole life based on the belief that you were gone. Daniel nodded, his face lined with pain. I know. Charlie told me years ago, I'm happy that you found someone who could give you the life you deserved. But I would have chosen you, Rebecca said. If you'd given me the choice, I would have chosen to disappear with you. With twin 5-year-olds? Living under false identities, always looking over our shoulders, never knowing if we were safe? That's not a life for children, Rebecca. The conversation was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. 25 years of separation couldn't be healed overnight, and the choices that Daniel and Luis had made, however understandable, had caused immeasurable pain to the people they'd left behind. With Daniel and Luis alive to testify, the case against Charlie Klein Sullivan became much stronger, but also much more complicated. Charlie had kidnapped 2 police officers, held them against their will, and facilitated their disappearance, but he'd also saved their lives. The federal prosecutor struggled with how to handle the charges. Charlie had committed serious crimes, but his cooperation and his decision not to kill Daniel and Luis had to count for something. In the end, Charlie pleaded guilty to kidnapping, conspiracy, and money laundering charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, but with the possibility of parole after 15 years if he continued to cooperate with authorities. Sheriff Harland Ross, even in death, faced consequences for his actions. A federal investigation revealed that the corruption in Pine Bluff County had been even more extensive than anyone had realized. Ross had received over $2 million in bribes over the course of his career, money that was seized from his estate and distributed to law enforcement victim compensation funds. The Pine Bluff County Sheriff's Department underwent a complete reorganization with federal oversight to ensure that the culture of corruption that had allowed Ross to operate for so long could never take root again. But the most important consequence was the closure, incomplete though it might be, for the families who had spent 25 years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Sarah thought the case was closed when she received one final unexpected phone call. It was from Daniel, and his voice was tight with fear. Detective Collings, we have a problem. Luis and I just spotted someone watching Maria's house in San Antonio, someone who definitely doesn't belong in the neighborhood. Despite all the precautions, word had leaked that Daniel and Luis were alive. And if word had reached the wrong people, the very danger that had forced them to disappear in 1998 might be threatening them again. Sarah immediately contacted Agent Santos and arranged for federal protection for all the family members. But she also knew that the only way to truly end this case was to eliminate the threat permanently. The cartel contacts that Ross and Charlie had worked with were still operating in Texas. They had long memories and longer reach. As long as Daniel and Luis were alive to testify about the money laundering operation, they would never be truly safe. Sarah made a decision that went against every protocol she'd ever been taught. She was going to use Daniel and Luis as bait to draw out the remaining conspirators. The plan was dangerous and probably illegal, but it was the only way to ensure that the two men could finally live their lives without constantly looking over their shoulders. Sarah arranged for word to leak that Daniel and Luis would be testifying in a grand jury proceeding in Houston the following week. Then, she and Agent Santos set up surveillance around the courthouse, waiting to see who would show up to try to stop them. What they discovered was that the corruption in Pine Bluff County had roots that went much deeper than anyone had imagined. The surveillance operation revealed a network of corrupt officials that extended far beyond Sheriff Ross and Charlie K.S. There were judges who had dismissed cases, prosecutors who had refused to file charges, federal agents who had leaked information, and business leaders who had laundered money through legitimate enterprises. For 3 days, Sarah and Agent Santos watched as various figures from this network converged on Houston, all apparently interested in ensuring that Daniel and Luis never made it to the grand jury. On the morning of the supposed testimony, the trap was sprung. FBI agents arrested 12 people in coordinated raids across Texas, dismantling a corruption network that had operated for decades. Among those arrested was Judge Patricia Morrison, who had dismissed numerous cases involving Charlie's associates, District Attorney Robert Hayes, who had refused to prosecute several drug trafficking cases, and most shocking of all, FBI agent Thomas Wright, who had been assigned to the original investigation into Daniel and Luis's disappearance, and had been feeding information to Sheriff Ross throughout the investigation. The arrests made national news. Decades-long corruption network exposed in Texas was the headline in every major newspaper. The story of 2 deputies who had disappeared to expose corruption, only to return 25 years later to finish the job, captured the public imagination. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't the headlines or the accolades. It was the phone call she received from Daniel 3 weeks after the arrests. "Detective Collings, Luis and I wanted to thank you. For the first time in 25 years, we actually feel safe." Even with the corruption network exposed and dismantled, Sarah felt like there were still unanswered questions about the case. Sheriff Harlan Ross's suicide had been too convenient, too well-timed to be coincidental. Her suspicions were confirmed when Agent Santos called with news from the forensics team that had examined Ross's body. "Sarah, I don't think Ross killed himself. The angle of the gunshot wound is wrong. The powder burns aren't consistent with suicide, and we found defensive wounds on his hands. Someone had murdered Harlan Ross and made it look like suicide. But who and why?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Charlie Klein Sullivan, calling from federal prison. "Detective, I need to tell you something about Harlan's death." I lied when I said I didn't know anything about it. Sarah arranged to meet with Charlie at the federal penitentiary where he was being held. What he told her provided the final pieces of the puzzle. "After I was arrested, Harlan called me. He was panicked, saying that if I testified against him, some very dangerous people were going to be exposed. People who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened their operation." According to Charlie, Ross had been planning to fake his own death and disappear, just like Daniel and Luis had done years earlier. But his cartel contacts had decided that Ross knew too much and was too much of a liability. They killed him to keep him quiet, then made it look like suicide to avoid scrutiny. If people thought he'd killed himself out of guilt, they wouldn't dig too deeply into his death. Sarah realized that Ross's murder had actually been a stroke of luck for her investigation. If he'd successfully faked his death and disappeared, she might never have been able to build a case against the broader corruption network. Charlie, why didn't you tell me this earlier? Because I was afraid they'd come after me next. But now that you've arrested everyone, I figured it was safe to tell the truth. 6 months after the arrests, District Attorney Elizabeth Harper held a press conference that had been 25 years in the making. Standing at a podium in front of the Pine Bluff County Courthouse, surrounded by FBI agents, local law enforcement, and the families of Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, Harper made an announcement that officially closed one of Texas's most notorious cold cases. Today, I can definitively state that former Pine Bluff County Sheriff Harlan Ross and Charles Klein Sullivan were responsible for the kidnapping and forced disappearance of deputies Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega on September 15, 1998. Harper went on to detail the extensive corruption network that had operated in Pine Bluff County for decades, the money laundering operation that had funneled millions of cartel dollars through the community, and the web of bribes and threats that had kept the truth hidden for 25 years. While we cannot bring criminal charges against Sheriff Ross due to his death, we can say with certainty that he was the architect of a criminal enterprise that corrupted law enforcement at every level and threatened the safety of our entire community. But the most emotional moment of the press conference came when Harper introduced special guests, Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega, appearing in public for the first time since their disappearance. Both men looked older, weathered by 25 years of living under assumed identities, but they stood tall as Harper praised their courage in originally investigating the corruption and their bravery in returning to testify against those who had forced them into exile. These two men sacrificed everything, their careers, their identities, their relationships with their families, to expose the truth about corruption in Pine Bluff County. Their commitment to justice, even at tremendous personal cost, serves as an inspiration to law enforcement officers everywhere. Daniel stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but emotional. Luis and I became police officers because we believed in protecting and serving our community. When we discovered that corruption had infected the very department we served, we had a choice: stay silent and keep our comfortable lives, or risk everything to do what was right. He paused, looking out at the crowd of reporters and community members. We chose to do what was right, and we'd make the same choice again. But we couldn't have done it without Detective Sarah Collins, who refused to let this case remain unsolved. Her dedication and courage brought us home and brought justice to our community. The resolution of the Mercer-Vega case had far-reaching consequences throughout Texas law enforcement. Federal oversight was implemented in dozens of rural counties where corruption was suspected. New protocols were established for investigating officer disappearances. And most importantly, whistleblower protections were strengthened to ensure that officers who reported corruption wouldn't face the same fate as Daniel and Luis. But the personal aftermath was more complicated. Daniel and Rebecca decided not to reconcile their marriage. Too much time had passed, too many life changes had occurred for them to simply pick up where they'd left off in 1998. But they maintained a close friendship, and Daniel began slowly rebuilding relationships with his daughters. Luis, who had never married, moved back to Texas and took a job with the state attorney general's office investigating public corruption. His experience living under a false identity had given him unique insights into how criminals operated, making him incredibly effective at his new job. Sarah received commendations from both the FBI and the Texas Department of Public Safety for her work on the case. She was promoted to chief detective and became the go-to investigator for cold cases throughout the region. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the impact on Pine Bluff County itself. The revelation of the corruption network and the resolution of the Mercer-Vega case had been traumatic for the community, but it had also been cleansing. Trust in law enforcement, which had been eroded by decades of corruption, began to slowly rebuild under new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. 2 years after the press conference, Sarah received a call that reminded her that some cases are never really closed. It was from Agent Santos, and her voice carried a familiar urgency. "Sarah, we've got a problem. A body was found in the Brazos River near Carter Bridge. Male, approximately 60 years old, been in the water for several weeks. And, Sarah, he had Charlie K.S.'s wallet in his pocket." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Charlie Klein Sullivan was supposed to be in federal prison, serving his sentence for his role in the conspiracy. If his body was in the Brazos River, it meant one of two things. Either he'd escaped and been murdered, or someone else had been killed, and Charlie's wallet planted on the body. Neither possibility was good. Sarah drove to the scene, where she found Agent Santos examining a body that had been pulled from the river near the same location where Daniel and Luis had made their last traffic stop in 1998. "Is it Charlie?" Sarah asked. "That's what we need to figure out." "The body is pretty decomposed, but the height and build are consistent. We've sent DNA samples to the lab, but it'll be a few days before we get results." Sarah studied the body, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she knew about Charlie's imprisonment. When was the last time anyone verified that Charlie was actually in his cell? Agent Santos pulled out her phone and made a call to the federal penitentiary. The conversation was brief, and her expression grew increasingly grim. "Sarah, Charlie Klein Sullivan was found dead in his cell 3 weeks ago. Apparent heart attack. The body was cremated according to his wishes, with no family members present." Sarah stared at the decomposed corpse in front of her. If Charlie had died in prison 3 weeks ago, then whose body was this? And why did it have Charlie's wallet? The mystery of Pine Bluff County, it seemed, wasn't over yet. But that's a story for another investigation, one that would test Sarah's skills and determination in ways she couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, she could take satisfaction in knowing that Daniel Mercer and Luis Vega were finally home, that their families had answers, and that the corruption that had plagued Pine Bluff County for decades had been exposed and destroyed. Sometimes, in law enforcement, that's the best outcome you can hope for. Not perfect justice, but enough truth to let people heal and move forward. And sometimes that has to be enough. 5 years later, Pine Bluff County honored Mercer and Vega. Sarah Collings reflected, then a text came. "New cold case?" She smiled. Her work wasn't done.